Hey guys, what's going on? I hope you had a great Easter weekend. Hope you spent some time with your family. Hope you celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. Um, what an incredible thing to think about that he loved you and I enough to suffer death on the cross at Golgotha, to be buried in a tomb. And thankfully, he rose again, which gives us hope of something different than just life ending. Speaking of endings, today we're going to wrap up World War II. Make sure you take a look at the weekly forecast to get an idea of what's coming up this week. You really have four assignments. You have a video and lecture today. You have some document questions that are due on Wednesday. The only part of those you have to do is the questions. You do not have to do the essay. Um, Number three is you're going to have a study guide that's going to be due on Friday, and then you're going to have a test on Friday. We'll have a couple of review sessions available this week via Zoom or Google Meet. Um, Other than that, that is the plan. So with that, and without any further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about the Pacific. You remember last week we talked about the end of the war for Europe. We talked about how D-Day ultimately leads us to VE Day, victory in Europe, when Hitler will commit suicide, and then about a week later the Nazis will surrender, and the war will be over thanks to pressure from the West by the British and the Americans, and from the East by the Russians. Today we're going to talk about the Pacific theater, specifically the Japanese versus the Americans, which was a single-handed war between America and Japan for the majority of the time. So you see a question to ponder here. What turned the tide of war against the Japanese? Right? And so the first thing we want to talk about is island hopping. What is island hopping? And this is going to be the strategy that is used by the Americans to defeat the Japanese. It's island hopping because, as you know, the Pacific Ocean is filled with thousands and thousands of little and big islands. And in order to approach from where we had a settlement, which if you're looking at this particular map, it's right over here by the good old Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, moving to the west towards Japan is going to be difficult, right? And so along the way, you're going to stop at a number of islands. It was an offensive attack launched by the Allies in the Pacific. The goal was simply this: to recapture small island after small island after small island throughout the Pacific, which would inch us slowly closer towards Japan. Well, what do those islands have? What benefits did they hold for us as the Allies? Well, there's two big things. If you're fighting a battle on the ocean, your only weapons are your boats and your planes, both of which need to refuel and resupply. Predominantly, planes have a limited range on which they can fly on gas. And so these provided you with refueling stations. So if you were flying long missions, you could land an airplane, refuel it, and then take off and fly on to your target. Or eventually, the goal was that you got close enough to Japan where you weren't flying from aircraft carriers, or you weren't having to stop multiple times and refuel. You just took off, went and made a bombing run, and came back, right? This island hopping campaign is going to be extremely important because air superiority is a huge deal in the battle for the Pacific. The Japanese had incredible fighter planes. They had incredible pilots. And they had willingness to die if you think about the kamikaze attacks, right? And so this is going to be a huge part of what allows the Americans to win the war in the Pacific. We can talk about the battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. This picture at the bottom is from Iwo Jima. You see these men raising the flag. Probably the most famous photograph from World War II. Now, ironically enough, it's actually the second time that these Marines had raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi that day. They had gone on the top, raised the flag. There was no news photographer. They wanted to do it again. Now, these two islands, why are they important? And if we were to go back to this map, right, Iwo Jima is right here, close enough to fly to the Japanese mainland, and Okinawa is right here again, very, very close to the Japanese mainland. And so they play a major strategic role in that island hopping campaign because they allow us to get close enough and provide us with the ability to plan a major attack on the main islands of Japan, which are four. Iwo Jima, which is the bottom here, is a black volcanic sand island. Thousands of men lose their lives in incredibly intense and violent fighting. It held two airfields that were close enough for us to lead bombing raids on Japan. one of the big lessons we learned from Iwo Jima is the incredible tenacity and the willingness to fight to the absolute death that the Japanese held, to the point that people were jumping off of cliffs committing suicide rather than be captured. And that goes back to the ancient samurai traditions of the Japanese, that there was dishonor in surrender. And that if you didn't fight to the death, that you were actually doing dishonor to not just yourself, but to your ancestors and others. Okinawa is important because of its proximity to Japan. But the biggest thing it taught us was the amount of lives, from an American perspective, it would take to capture what would be considered a main Japanese island. And Okinawa, again, shows the tenacity of the Japanese soldiers and how hard they fight and their willingness to fight until the very, very last man. I mean, honestly, when we talk about the Japanese mentality of World War II, never surrender, there was a soldier who was found in the 1970s, 40 years after World War II was over, to the point that had to go get his old commander who didn't get tried for war crimes and die, who was well into his 80s and 90s, to come and tell him, hey, the war is really over, because he didn't believe it was over. He was hiding in the jungle, stealing things from farms. Still, what does this do? We're victorious in both battles, but it's a high cost. And we learned that the Allies are willing to fight due to the very bitter end, and that in order to defeat them, it would take some large show of force, or it was going to take a lot of time and more importantly, a lot of lives to accomplish that. And that ultimately leads to the decision. You see the name here. You see Little Boy and Fat Man, right? You have Little Boy and you have Fat Man. We here in East Tennessee played an important role in these. This is where a lot of the enriched material for these bombs came from, was Oak Ridge, out of the National Labs. After those massive casualties that are experienced at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Harry Truman is led to make a decision. Now, why did Truman take over? Well, he was vice president to FDR, and FDR dies in April. And so Truman has to make this incredible decision in the summer of 1945 of whether or not to use these new atomic weapons to usher in the nuclear age, a new level of mass casualty. Right? And so these first two bombs are called Little Boy and Fat Man, and they are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay? They're carried, one of them was carried by the Enola Gay, you see there at the top. Hundreds of thousands and millions of people will end up losing their lives because of these two bombs. Hundreds of thousands within an instant are vaporized. And then thousands and thousands more will die from radiation, and even to this day. And what this does is it shows the Japanese that, man, the Americans are willing to do whatever it takes to win. And if they have two of these bombs that they're willing to use, what else could they do? And it's a huge deal. And there's a question that surrounds the atomic bombs. It's actually what your document-based questions are about. It is, should we have dropped the atomic bombs on Japan? Is that a war crime, killing 400,000+ people in one city in literally seconds, leveling an entire city? Was that a war crime comparable to what the Nazis and Japanese did? And it's an interesting thing to ponder, right? And so all of that leads us to what is called VJ Day. And you see there in the background probably the most famous picture in regards to World War II, the famous sailor kissing the nurse as he's coming home. The Allies accepted an unconditional surrender. Remember, unconditional just means the Japanese said, whatever, we're done. Now, I just mentioned a minute ago the mentality of the Japanese: fight until you can't, until there is no surrender, right? That there would be, it's dishonor, it's death before dishonor, right? When the announcement of the surrender was made days after August 14th, 1945, thousands of people actually stormed the Imperial Palace, soldiers in the army, trying to stop the surrender, which had already happened. Some general stats for you, right? At the end of World War II, 17 million had died in combat, which is more, by the way, than World War I. Approximately 60 million people were lost in total. It's an incredible death toll, an incredible cost of life, right? And unfortunately, it's not done yet. There's a lot of post-war tension. And so you see here the post-war, the fallout. Again, we see our photo of VJ Day. The war is over. MacArthur is going to rule Japan. Peace. It's over. And the question is here is what led us from World War II to the Cold War, right? So let's start by talking a little bit about what was going on, okay? So multiple meetings are held. We talked about the Tehran Conference. We talked about the Yalta Conference. And then the last one was called the Potsdam Conference, which actually happens in April of 1945 after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, right? And there's all these disagreements and arguments, and it's really the Americans versus the Soviets going back and forth. And so what did America want for Europe post-World War II? And the answer is they wanted free elections, so democracy. They wanted a United Nations, so a group of world nations getting together to determine policy. And really, ultimately, we needed help to defeat Japan from the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union wanted buffer states. They wanted a border between them and the West. And they needed some warm water ports. And they didn't trust the West, that the West wouldn't try to attack them and take over. And so they make compromises and reach an agreement. And the agreement is to partition Europe. And what that simply means is that Germany is split into four pieces. You have Western Germany, Eastern Germany, Britain, America, and France rule the West. Soviet Union rules the East. And then the Soviet Union gains control of all of Eastern Europe. And you see this nice little red line right here that falls down that area. Winston Churchill would compare it to an iron curtain, right? The idea that an iron curtain has fallen on Europe. Stalin feared free election because free election is the process of the people selecting a leader. They don't like what you do, they're not going to elect you. And so he believed that it was a push for the West to gain control and to push the Soviets out. And so he was against those things. And he obviously ends up winning. One of the good things about post-World War II is the Nuremberg trials. And not just the Nuremberg trials. There are dozens of trials that are held for war crimes. The most famous is the Nuremberg trials. It's where a number of Nazi criminals, such as Heinrich Himmler and some of those guys who were in the SS, who were part of the final solution, the Holocaust, are put on trial for the things that they did. And they are punished. There's also groups held in Japan and in Italy, again, trying these people for the terrible things that they had done. The most famous is the Nuremberg trials. You see a picture of that there. It's held in Nuremberg, Germany. It's where a number of Nazi war criminals were convicted. So finally, what comes of the whole thing? It's called the Cold War. And the Cold War begins as tensions between the West and the East rise. And predominantly when we say the West, we mean the United States. Okay? Those disagreements rise into what is called the Cold War. We call it Cold War because nobody ever physically shoots each other, right? And so it's a war of ideas and ideologies, not a war of physical fighting. But it will have the world on the brink of a third world war multiple times. It's an ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that dominates world affairs all the way from 1945 to 1989. Almost every war, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the first war in Afghanistan, all of those wars are going to be directly related in some way, shape to communism, the Russians, and freedom or capitalism or democracy, the United States, against one another. And we're going to talk about a number of those things in our next unit as we discuss the Cold War. But for today, that's it, guys. I hope you have a great day. I will see you on Thursday. Love y'all. Have a